This chapter will be discussing body composition and nutrition for sport. First, we'll discuss the classifications of nutrients and then go into a little bit more depth with carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. We'll also discuss the importance of water and electrolyte balance. Again, remembering that this goes back to the hormonal input in that hormonal system, the endocrine system. We'll then talk about nutrition and athletic performances, and then how we can assess body composition in a variety or myriad of ways. And finally, we'll discuss the body composition, weight, and sport performance related to overall exercise physiology, related to optimal weight achievement, and some different interesting facts and figures around the obesity epidemic that is currently in the United States. The question of the day is, what is the optimal recommended rate of weight loss for an individual? As you probably are aware of, there are three major macronutrients, and these are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. We've discussed each of these in the bioenergetics chapter and how the importance of those converted to ATP is to exercise physiology. But there is a recommended balance of each of these macronutrients. And you can see on this slide that the majority of your nutrients in kilocalories should be coming from carbohydrates. You have 55 to 60% of your daily kilocalories are from carbohydrates. Less than 35% of your kilocalories should be coming from fat, and less than 10% of those fat calories should be coming from saturated fats. And then protein should be between 10 and 15% of your total kilocalories. So if you notice, this is different than what a lot of diets call for, such as a low carb diet. You're emphasizing more of the fat and proteins than what the recommendation is. If we look at carbohydrates and protein intake, a lot of these can be based on your current weight, and that weight is going to be per kilogram body weight. If we're looking at training goals, oftentimes, if we're trying to build muscle, you'd have your protein consumption up to 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram. So if you weighed 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, you would need 170 grams of protein. Likewise, we have a similar calculation that we can utilize for carbohydrate, 3 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight. So again, we'll discuss each of these different nutrients. We'll first discuss carbohydrates, then fats, then proteins. Vitamins and minerals will also be discussed near the end, and the importance of specific vitamins and minerals for exercise performance. And then we'll transition into discussion around water consumption and electrolytes. First, carbohydrates are going to be composed of monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. If you remember, these are the building blocks of carbohydrates. So you have glucose, fructose, and galactose. If we combine, say, glucose and fructose, one of each of those, that disaccharide is going to give us sucrose or table sugar. So anytime someone says they want to cut out sugars, they're also cutting out carbohydrates. The function of carbohydrates are an actual important function. You do need them for energy. It's the sole source for the nervous system. And if we're trying to make ATP again for the brain, the central nervous system, those types of things, we are going to need carbohydrates. They are obviously regulated by fat and protein metabolism. So the higher that you have of carbohydrates, the less you're going to utilize, typically, fat and protein for ATP production. Also, if you remember, fat and protein have other functions in the body outside of just an energy source. So this would be an important thing if you're trying to, again, build muscle or have, regeneration of cell membranes, things like that. The protein and fat in your consumption could be used for that instead of for energy. If we look at the excess consumption of carbohydrates, that's going to be stored in the muscle as glycogen or in the liver as glycogen. And glycogen stores are often determined by your dietary carbohydrate intake. So the determinants of glycogen replacement are obviously going to be dependent on how much you're consuming, as well as the type of activity you are performing. So if you're doing eccentric training, remember that this is the type of training where you're elongating the muscle and causing damage. So you're having that negative type of lift, or it's a heavier weight than maybe what you can push up. That's going to cause a lot of damage, and that increased damage at the muscle will decrease glycogen synthesis. Glycogen maintenance, like we've talked about, is between that 3 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram body weight. And depending on the type of athlete, you may have to obviously consume on that upper end. If you have a higher intensity exercise program, you're going to need more carbohydrates because you're utilizing more of that for your ATP production. Oftentimes, your drive for carbohydrate intake is not sufficient enough to replenish what you have used in exercise. So if you are having insufficient carbohydrate intake, you may be feeling heavy and tired. And if you're, a college athlete or any sort of athlete and you've been feeling tired, a little bit of that heavy feeling, you may need to up your carbohydrate intake. This figure, we're looking at the influence of dietary carbohydrates on muscle glycogen storage. So if you can see on the x-axis, we've got training bouts that happen every 24 hours. So every day for 3 days, this individual was exercising for 2 hours, and there was a muscle biopsy or muscle glycogen levels were taken before and after exercise, and then at the 12-hour mark between exercise bouts. Notice that over a 3-day period with a low carbohydrate diet where they had only 40% of their calories coming from carbohydrates, they had significant reduction in their muscle glycogen levels. So we had individuals that were basically starting off at around 120 millimoles per kilogram of muscle glycogen. They both groups decreased to 60, but only the high carbohydrate diet, the one that was above that 60% of their kilocalories coming from carbohydrate, bounced back to what was close to their initial muscle glycogen levels. So they're around 110, maybe 115. Notice that there's this bouncing effect. Again, we're utilizing a lot of that muscle glycogen. We got below 100 milliliters per kilogram or millimoles per kilogram. Just at the end, that 3 hours, we're back up to about a net difference of 20 millimoles over the 3-day period. However, if we look at the low carbohydrate diet, there was never a rebound in the storage of muscle glycogen, and this significantly impacted the overall availability of carbohydrates to the point where you were at this most likely tired, heavy feeling after bout number 3, because again, we didn't have a very high level of muscle glycogen. And so we're most likely feeling tired because we're crossing that threshold of 25 millimoles per kilogram that we've discussed in previous chapters. This is also an important figure to look at, the relationship between pre-exercise muscle glycogen content and our time to exhaustion. So not only are we using muscle glycogen storage over time, over multiple bouts, but if you have a higher amount of muscle glycogen starting off, you're going to be able to exercise for a longer period of time. The exercise time to exhaustion and muscle glycogen were nearly 4 times greater when the subjects ate a carbohydrate-rich diet than when the diet was composed mostly of fat and protein. So how do we use this maybe to inform our dieting if we're going into a high intensity exercise program or we're trying to be at our highest performance? Well, doing a low carb diet or a high fat diet or high protein diet, something like that, is not going to be beneficial if you're looking at a higher intensity type of activity that you're wanting to be successful at. Notice that time to exhaustion was more than doubled for the high carbohydrate diet compared to the low carbohydrate diet. we were at around 180, 190 minutes of exercise time, whereas exhaustion hit the low carbohydrate diet around 60 minutes, which is an interesting finding. So again, if you're wanting to enhance your higher intensity activity and the time that you can perform that in, having a high carbohydrate diet is going to be beneficial. Not all carbohydrates are considered equal. You have what's called a glycemic index that's going to categorize the specific type of food and the response in the blood to the amount of sugar that is put into it. So if you have a low glycemic index food, that's not going to spike the blood sugar as significantly as a moderate or as a high glycemic index food. You can see a number of options for each of these different glycemic index foods. If you wanted a low blood sugar response, not getting into that hyperglycemia type of response, spaghetti, legumes, milk, apples, pears, peanuts, M&Ms, and yogurt are going to be good things for that low blood sugar response. And I know M&Ms, that doesn't really seem like it should be a low glycemic index food, but according to research, it is. And high glycemic index foods are things like sports drinks, jelly beans, cornflakes, and pretzels. So this is something to consider when you're, again, trying to prepare for an activity, an exercise, or maybe a performance. The type of food that you're eating and when you're eating that glycemic index carbohydrate is going to be really important. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Now, the glycemic index, that value is not a perfect value because some individuals have differing responses to the glycemic index foods that they're consuming. So it's not always going to be cut and dry the exact same for every individual. Also, depending on what you combine that with will have a differing impact on glycemic index. So if you have food that has a high glycemic index number, like jelly beans, but you're eating that also with something that has a higher fat, like let's just say string cheese or some sort of cheese, the combination of both of those together will lower the glycemic index response because it takes longer time for fats and maybe proteins to be absorbed into that bloodstream and to be digested in the digestive tract. So it really does depend on the types of foods and what they're maybe combined with the other types of foods that you're eating as well. And the glycemic calculation is going to differ depending on what your reference food is. If you have glucose as the reference, or if you have white bread as the reference of 100. So instead, many people will calculate the glycemic load. The glycemic load takes into account the amount of carbohydrate in a serving of that food, as well as the glycemic index. So you can see how many grams multiplied by the glycemic index divided by 100 will give us that glycemic load. Carbohydrates are going to obviously be important for exercise. We were able to utilize those at a higher rate and more efficiently for oxygen compared to fats or for proteins. And so when we have carbohydrates, those factors that increase exercise time would be if we start exercise as a normal glycemic individual, or we consume a low glycemic pre-exercise snack 2 hours before exercise. We also can increase our overall carbohydrate load and the storage in the body by having a feeding time of high carbohydrates. So you can do carbohydrate loading, or carbo loading is what many people call it. If you watch The Office, you'll know that Michael Scott was not carbo loading appropriately. He started carbo loading minutes before exercise. That's going to actually decrease your ability to exercise. If you're wanting to carbo load appropriately, you can have that in the last 3 days leading up to an exercise bout or an exercise performance. Carbohydrate feeding during exercise is also really important. If you've ever ran extended time, like a half marathon or a marathon, you'll know that having food in goo or gel forms are going to be really important. Something that's really easy for your stomach to digest, maybe even liquid form like Gatorade or Powerade. Having that carbohydrate consumption during exercise is also going to increase your exercise time. Carbohydrates are obviously going to impact exercise time in a negative way if you are hypoglycemic and you're not carbo loading or having any sort of consumption during exercise. In this figure, we're seeing the influence of exercise intensity. So again, increasing intensity is going to utilize more and more carbohydrates. We're at 31%, 64%, 83%, and then 120 and 150% of our VO2 max are getting extremely anaerobic sprinting, right? We're seeing that we're utilizing our muscle glycogen stores at a greater rate. At relative high intensities, the rate of muscle glycogen use is extremely high compared with that at moderate or lower intensities. And you can see that here for 150% of your VO2 max. So all out sprinting, muscle glycogen starts at 60 and declines to 15 within 10 minutes of doing that interval training that one would expect. If we're looking at, say, the 64%, so right here, we're having that muscle glycogen starting at 80 and declining to 18 within 2 hours of exercise. So you're obviously able to exercise for a longer period of time if you're working at a lower intensity, but the rate that you're consuming that is going to be dependent on the intensity you're working at. And also, if we look, we're crossing this 20 millimoles per kilogram wet weight. Once we cross that, then we're seeing fatigue setting in. So we're stopping again with exercise after that threshold's been crossed. So it's not so important to look at the rate, but it's looking at the total amount of muscle glycogen if it relates to exercise and fatigue. If you are wanting to watch this video, you can click on the link. This is going to be in the PowerPoint, so clicking on the link will allow you to see Scott Trapp talking about tapering for peak performance. If you're wanting to enhance your exercise performance, again, the type of carbohydrate is going to be extremely important, and the timing of that carbohydrate consumption will be extremely important. So in the pre-exercise side of things, so you're preparing to exercise, it's important to have a lower glycemic index food so that you're having some sort of glycogen and carbohydrate loading. That's going to be a really important thing. During exercise, you're also going to want to take glucose in some form. A moderate to high glucose in a liquid or gel form, something easily digestible, is going to be extremely important. And then post-exercise, you want to take something for recovery so that you can build up that muscle glycogen and liver glycogen levels. If we look at the G series, you can see that Gatorade has actually made specific compositions of their product to meet the standards for each of these different phases of exercise, the pre-exercise, during, and post-exercise, and the composition is going to be significantly different depending on where you are. So you should be taking G1 pre-exercise, G2 during exercise, and G3 during post-exercise. So it's really cool kind of seeing science overlapping in the actual products that are available for exercising individuals. Like we've discussed, in the short term, you want to have carbohydrate intake prior to exercise. That's at least 2 hours before exercise. And if you're wanting to do a long-term pre-exercise carbohydrate intake, doing carbohydrate loading or glycogen loading is going to be over a period of days at high carbohydrate consumption rates and levels. To ensure, again, that you have a normal blood glucose concentration during exercise, taking a low glycemic index food, around 200 to 500 kilocalories is going to be great. And again, you want to make sure that you're consuming that no less than 2 hours before competition. So as an example, when I was running cross country, and my sister and I were actually running cross country at the same time for college, we would wake up extremely early for, like, say, a 8 o'clock gun start. We would be waking up at 5:30 to eat food and having cereal or toast or a banana or something similar to that, Pop-Tarts, right? You'd be consuming those at least 2 hours before exercise so your body had enough time to digest it and to put that into the bloodstream and have a normal glycemic response and hopefully elevate that muscle and liver glycogen levels to an appropriate level for success. We can see that here in the effects of pre-exercise carbohydrate feeding on blood glucose levels during exercise. One thing to note is that the decrease in blood glucose to hypoglycemia levels occurred with sugar feeding or some sort of feeding of carbohydrate 45 minutes before exercise. So that red line individual and group did not actually consume their carbohydrates at least 2 hours before activity. Those subjects during the sugar feeding trial were unable to complete the full 90 minutes of exercise expected at 70% of their VO2 max. They were only able to achieve 75 minutes. So notice that this is a really important piece, that exhaustion actually happened earlier in those people that ate something compared to those that didn't eat something within a 45 minutes prior to exercise time frame. So if you have to decide, do I eat or not eat? I'm not at least 2 hours prior to my exercise time frame. It's better to not eat to exercise for a longer period of time than to eat something within that time frame, go hyperglycemic, then hypoglycemic, and possibly lead to exhaustion earlier on. So this is an interesting thing to also note when we look at this from the endocrine side of things and trying to have glucagon and insulin. If we are trying to draw that liver glycogen into the blood, if we have hyperglycemia at the start of exercise, we're not going to actually start that liver glycogen breakdown and putting it into the blood until it's too late and we're already hypoglycemic. And you can see that in this figure for the individuals that ate 45 minutes before exercise. What's interesting is that carbohydrate consumption during exercise does not have the same effect or negative effect that the pre-exercise consumption would. So unlike pre-exercise carbohydrates, during exercise, having a carbohydrate does not trigger hypoglycemia. And it may be due to a couple of different factors. It may be due to that insulin binding site alteration we experience during exercise, where it's that greater sensitivity to insulin, moving blood sugar into the muscle easier because we're increasing that sensitivity, or it may be due to improved muscle permeability to glucose. The combination of each of these or some other factor is though impacting that consumption of carbohydrate and usage of that during exercise, that you can take pretty much anything that your stomach can handle and easily digest and extend your exercise time out for a very long period. So if you look at the ultra marathoners, those people that are running 50, 60, 75 miles at a time, these people are eating while they're exercising, and they're eating a long period, and they're eating for extended periods of time. Personally, I've done a 100-mile bike ride with a group of guys that were raising money for kids without dads, and we were exercising for 7 hours at a time or 6 hours at a time, and all of us would be eating throughout the ride. So we're on our bikes just eating goos and gels and easily digestible foods throughout this. And when you do that, you can really tell a difference. There are people that weren't able to complete the 100-mile bike ride because they weren't eating appropriately. I was eating on average like 4,000 calories over the 100 miles and feeling amazing throughout because, again, I had the energy to continue to work at a higher intensity. It's also important to consume specific carbohydrates and maybe even proteins, quality proteins and carbohydrates after exercise so you can replenish what you've used up during exercise. We can see in this trial, carbohydrate solutions were provided immediately following exercise, and muscle glycogen storage was 3 times higher during the first 2 hours of recovery compared to the other trial where nothing was ingested until 2 hours after. So in this, you can see that taking carbohydrates right after is going to have a significant impact on overall resynthesis or replenishing of glycogen, but there's no difference in muscle glycogen storage during the next 2 hours. So if you have the ability to, taking carbohydrates immediately after exercise is going to be extremely important for that resynthesis of muscle and liver glycogen. Also, the type and quality of carbohydrate is going to be extremely important. So if you are able to take, again, carbohydrates after and doing that immediately and 2 hours after exercise combined with the protein, you'll see that will increase that overall storage the most, according to this research by Ivy in 1999. Having simply glucose is going to be the next best thing. Again, both at immediately after and 2 hours after exercise. If you have no supplementation after exercise, you're having a significantly lower concentration of carbohydrates left in the muscle and in the liver. And again, if we're delaying this for 2 hours and then consuming just glucose, we're having about half the overall storage and replenishing that we would have compared to a quality carbohydrate and a protein combined together. So again, remember, after exercise, we have both protein synthesis at its highest and carbohydrate storage happening at its highest. Moving on to fat. Fat is obviously going to be an essential macronutrient for the body. Not only is it going to be a fuel substrate, but it is composing cell membranes and nerve fibers and required for steroid hormones and fat-soluble vitamins like A, E, D, and K. So it has more function than simply storage for energy like carbohydrates would be used for. When we're looking at how much we should be taking in, again, the total amount of calories should be less than 35% with zero trans fat, and of your total daily calories, less than 10% of those should be coming from saturated fats. Cholesterol levels should also be below 300 milligrams per day of consumption, but you will be utilizing fat for those lower intensity, higher volume types of activities, specifically endurance activities, when you are exercising. Again, free fatty acids is an important fuel for exercise. It can delay exhaustion after glycogen depletion has occurred. So if you have ever been to view a marathon, or if you've been performing a marathon, you'll see that around mile marker 21, 22, if someone is not replenishing their carbohydrates, you may see them kind of hitting the wall and they have to work at a lower intensity. Typically, that's going to be the outward appearance of what is happening internally, metabolically speaking, going from carbohydrates and transitioning to more reliance on fat. So the body cannot metabolize triglycerides. It has to actually break it down into glycerol and free fatty acids. And if you remember, those free fatty acids then go through beta oxidation and then are going through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to make ATP for activity. So if we have high fat intake, we're going to have an increase in our circulating free fatty acids, which is good, but it's going to be at a cost for glycogen storage, which is bad. So depending on the type of activity you're wanting to be successful in, if it's a higher intensity activity, you may want to, again, have higher carbohydrates because that's going to be the quickest substrate usage for ATP production. And the more that you have of that, that increased glycogen carbohydrate loading will obviously have a greater storehouse for that to occur. There currently are, though, no conclusive evidence studies on high fat diets and how those are going to be impacting performance. But from a practicality standpoint and just theoretically taking this through, one would assume that taking more carbohydrates in to do more of a higher intensity activity would be more beneficial than trying to force the system to use fat in that higher intensity successfully. Protein is also going to be an important macronutrient. Obviously, it has other essential functions other than a substrate for ATP production. It is used in cell structure, growth, repair, and maintenance, and obviously in enzymes, hormones, antibodies, and works also as a buffer. It can help to control the plasma volume via oncotic pressure. So if you have more protein in the blood, you'll be able to hold and retain that fluid because, again, you have that oncotic pressure that is trying to have water go towards solutes. And in this case, a protein would be considered a solute. There are 20 amino acids that are essential and non-essential, so we'll go through those on the next slide. But overall consumption should be around 15% of your total kilocalories, and having a minimum 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight for the regular diet consumption is going to be recommended. If you're doing a higher intensity anaerobic, or maybe you're a resistance trained, trying to be bodybuilding, that would be in that 1.6, 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. Here's a list of those essential and non-essential amino acids. So the difference between essential and non-essential is your body can create non-essential amino acids, but cannot create essential amino acids. So it's essential you take them in during your diet and consumption. So those essential amino acids are leucine, isoleucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, valine, and if you're a child, histidine. Once you become an adult, you're actually able to synthesize histidine, so that becomes a non-essential amino acid. One thing I do want to highlight in this, again, going back to mTOR, what we had talked about in the previous chapter, you have leucine that's extremely important in resistance training to try and build muscle and have muscle hypertrophy occurring. So if you're having a lack of that in your diet, your body can't make it naturally. So you should be taking that in during your normal daily consumption. Proteins, again, are going to be required in higher levels for those that are going to be strength training individuals, and also for the endurance trained individuals. You can be using this possibly as a fuel substrate. Protein intake exceeding that 1.7 grams per kilogram per day, according to the research currently, provides no additional advantages, but there are some emerging studies that show up to 3.3 grams per kilogram of body weight can be successful in having muscle hypertrophy, but again, it's not conclusive. Excessive protein is also going to be providing some risk for the kidneys by having them filter more and more. Putting that strain under the kidneys can be caused by excessive protein intake. So there are some health risks to consider as well. But taking, again, carbohydrate and a protein together after exercise is going to be the greatest thing you can do to improve glycogen and muscle protein synthesis following that exercise bout or performance. Moving on to vitamins, we've got different types of vitamins. They are fat soluble and water soluble. So again, the fat soluble ones are A, D, E, and K. I remember them by just remembering a DEC. DEC spelled D-E-K. These can be toxic if you take large amounts of them, and because they are fat soluble, they can get into the cell membrane, cross over that, and be stored in the cell, and so they can get to toxic levels, whereas water soluble ones like B complex vitamins and vitamin C, it is extremely difficult to reach toxicity because you can easily excrete those in your urine. So these, again, are organic molecules. They're going to have carbon in them. They can act as catalysts and cofactors for chemical reactions. And of course, you're going to be ingesting them in your normal dietary consumption. And generally, unless you're deficient in a vitamin like vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin A, it's not going to be helpful to supplement with vitamins because, again, you're not deficient. If you're not deficient, you're not going to have your exercise performance inhibited. Taking more and excess ones could be toxic if they are fat soluble. And they don't really show any benefit for exercise performance. So some of the vitamins that are important for exercise are the B complex vitamins and vitamin C. B complex vitamins are important for cellular metabolism and ATP production, and as you can see, they're needed in that conversion for pyruvate to acetyl-CoA that we talked about in the bioenergetics chapter. They're also important for those taxis that take hydrogen ions to the electron transport chain. those are FAD and NAD, and for erythropoiesis. So if we're trying to make more red blood cells, B complex vitamins are going to help support that. Vitamin C is also important. Again, another water soluble vitamin that is important for collagen maintenance and antioxidant. So these are going to make sure that damage isn't occurring at high levels to the cell when we're making reactive oxygen species or ROSs. They're also going to be important for the adrenal hormone synthesis and for iron absorption. So if someone is anemic, needing to increase their red blood cell production, they may be taking B complex vitamins, iron, and vitamin C to help with that iron absorption. We also have vitamin E, which is stored in the muscle and fat as a potent antioxidant as well, and this prevents oxidation of vitamin A and vitamin C. These antioxidants are going to, again, disarm free radicals. Those are called reactive oxygen species or ROSs, but supplementation has not been proven to improve performance. Minerals, on the other hand, do not have carbon in them, so they're going to be inorganic. And these are going to be found mainly on the periodic table. So you've got calcium, you've got phosphorus, you've got sodium, potassium, chloride, iron. All of those are going to be considered minerals. So these can be found in higher levels that you should be taking them in, all the way down to trace elements or microminerals. Calcium is one of those that's going to be a macromineral. This is going to improve bone density, nerve and muscle function. So if you're having lower levels of calcium, you can be at risk of osteopenia or osteoporosis, which would be very porous bones, which are going to also be having that individual more at risk of breaking those bones because they're not as rigid and firm. Phosphorus is also going to be bound in calcium in the bones, and as you have probably picked up, it's in ATP. It's the P portion. It's inorganic phosphate. That phosphorus is going to be really important for metabolism and bioenergetics as well as cell membranes and working as a buffer. Iron is going to be an important piece. It's critical for, again, hemoglobin, that heme portion, and myoglobin in transporting oxygen. So if you are deficient in iron, that can lead to anemia, and that's going to significantly impair your exercise performance, as we'll talk about in the next two slides. Sodium, potassium, and chloride are going to be important in interstitial fluid and regulating that overall fluid balance, as we talked about in the fluid and electrolyte balance of aldosterone and ADH. So again, if you remember, aldosterone is going to retain sodium. That will help with that retention of water at the kidneys. So these are also going to be important for nerve impulses, cardiac rhythm, and fluid and pH balance. Excessive intake of these can be dangerous. You can have significant kidney problems as well, like kidney stones being generated when you have significant levels of these minerals. Iron, as we had talked about, is an important piece in your VO2 max, blood transport of oxygen, normal red blood cell production. And if we look at the NCAA Division I institutions, only 43% of those institutions regularly test female athletes for iron deficiency. And you may be asking, well, why is female athlete an important thing to note? If you remember, female athletes, and we'll talk about this in the last chapter of the text that we'll be discussing this semester, female athletes are going to have menstruation, so losing significant amounts of blood in a monthly cycle. You'll see that females then will have to be at a higher rate of red blood cell production and have erythropoietin increasing. If you're having females that are having menstrual dysfunction, they may also have a dietary dysfunction, and then that will combine with a bone mineral content that will be lower to make what's called the female athlete triad, as we'll talk about later. Anyway, iron consumption, if it's not being taken high levels in the diets, maybe you're having a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet, then you'll probably have to be taking iron in some form to supplement that, because looking at this, higher amounts of female athletes, it's around an estimated 90% of female athletes are going to be deficient for iron. And again, if we're looking at aerobic performance, that can significantly be improved in the iron deficient athlete to improve oxygen carrying capacity, VO2 max, and overall performance. So what an athlete is going to do is, if they're tested for iron deficiency, you'd need to measure their serum ferritin, serum iron, total iron binding capacity, and iron saturation to get a true picture of how well that individual is for their iron in the body. Moving on to water and electrolyte balance, if we look at the total body weight, 50 to 60% of that is coming from water. Fat-free mass is going to hold a lot more water, so as we'll talk about in a few slides, this can be utilized to determine body composition. So if you have more fat-free mass, you're going to have more water. If you have more water, then an electrical impulse could travel faster than it could in a fat mass, which only has 10% of that fat mass containing water. If we look at sweat rates, 1 to 6% of the body weight loss is common from sweat in athletes. If you have more than that, in that 9 to 12% of your body weight loss through sweating, that can lead to fatality. And if we look, typically we see 2/3 of the body water is stored intracellularly, so within the cell, while 1/3 is going to be in the extracellular portion. This is obviously a medium for transportation and diffusion, for temperature regulation, and for blood pressure maintenance. So water is an extremely important factor. If you're not taking in enough water and liquid, you're going to have exercise impedance for sure. You're going to gain water at rest in a variety of different ways. You have about 33 milliliters per kilogram per day that you'll be taking in, or it's recommended to take in. 90% of that's coming from the things you take in, like food and drink, but 10% of this is actually coming from cellular respiration, where you're breaking down carbohydrates and fats, maybe even proteins for energy. And the byproduct of that, those hydrogen ions combining with oxygen, is water. So you'll actually have water that you're gaining just by normal cellular respiration. You will have water loss at rest coming from evaporation in the skin, but most of this is going to be coming from excretion in the form of urine coming from the kidneys. You have excretion also from the large intestine and from sweat, but this is at rest. Obviously, once we start exercising, dehydration can occur from exercise due to increased sweat levels to thermoregulate, as we've talked about in previous chapters. And so if we're having greater water loss than our water gain through consumption, that's obviously going to be a good path to lead to dehydration, which is not so good. So there are obviously factors that are going to regulate body temperature and sweat. And we've talked about these. You got metabolic rates. Increasing in metabolic rate will increase heat production. Your body size, air velocity, humidity, and radiant heat are all going to be factoring into this sweat rate. Here's a comparison of that resting and prolonged exercise for where the source of that water loss is coming from. Both of these are going to have, again, a percentage of 100%, but the amount of water and fluid loss is going to be mainly from sweating when we're doing prolonged exercise, 91%, or 1,200 milliliters per hour, compared to sweating just only 4 milliliters per hour and making up 5% while at rest. This is really just a figure of what we have previously talked about, the different percentages of where you'd be gaining and losing water from, depending on what you're doing, if it's rest or exercise. Having impaired water levels in the body can obviously impair and impact aerobic performance. Typically what you see is an increase in temperature, increases sweat loss, and can decrease performance because there is less fluid to continue to buffer that temperature, and also less fluid to do all of the other processes like increase the plasma volume to maintain cardiac output. If plasma volume decreases, cardiovascular function is inhibited and thermoregulatory function is also inhibited. But the effects of dehydration on anaerobic and strength performance is not as clear-cut as it is for aerobic performance. Here we're seeing that running velocity is impacted by hydration. So if you're dehydrated 2%, you can be running or be expected to be running at a lower velocity for a variety of distances. Notice that 1500 meters, you're having a 3% difference, 3% slower meters per minute. And as we increase in the distance traveled, the speed or running velocity is going to be declining. You can also expect electrolytes to be lost in the sweat, and this is a normal thing that we've talked about when we were exercising in a warm environment in that chapter. Sweat is, again, going to be similar to and derived from plasma because you're taking that from the blood to try and thermoregulate. That plasma volume will decrease. Typically, you see a higher concentration of sodium and again, chlorine is going to be in that sweat. The remaining ions in the body have to be then redistributed and utilized for normal electrical processes that we talked about for the mineral concentration. Electrolyte loss can occur in the urine as well when your kidney regulation increases electrolyte excretion. If you have decreased urine production, though, like you would expect with exercise, ADH and aldosterone saving some of that sodium, specifically, again, aldosterone, then that electrolyte excretion is going to be decreased, but you'll have an increased drive for drinking water. Here again, you can see that the site of the electrolyte concentration and osmolality is going to be changing for each electrolyte, that we're having higher levels in the plasma for sodium, for chloride, and those are going to obviously be higher than sweat. And so that's going to, again, help facilitate that retention of fluid at the kidneys. Having that higher concentration of sodium will allow for fluid to move from the kidneys and be retained in the body. During exercise, you should be consuming water, and the drive for drinking water, or that thirst, is going to be dictated by those sensory receptors, the baroreceptors and the osmoreceptors, looking and assessing if there is low blood volume and high blood osmolality, or high concentration of solutes and low solvent, low overall volume. But this thirst drive is not well calibrated to hydration levels. So you may be drinking for up to 2 days after exercise to fully rehydrate yourself. But if you are drinking during exercise, it's going to be beneficial to try and minimize that overall water loss in the body, and hopefully you can maintain performance and cardiovascular function if you are taking in Gatorade, Powerade, water, or something like that during exercise. Similar to what we talked about when exercising in that warm environment, this figure is showing the heart rate during 6 hours of treadmill running in the heat. First off, side note, I can't believe that people signed up for this study. Running for 6 hours on a treadmill in a warm environment sounds like absolute awfulness. These subjects received no fluid or a saline solution or water. So if we're looking, the no fluid group didn't actually run for all 6 hours because they got too fatigued, right? Subjects that were deprived of that fluid were exhausted and probably were overheating to a degree, couldn't complete that full 6 hours. But if we look at this over 1 hour increments, we're seeing that for the water condition, heart rate stayed at about 130 beats per minute for the whole 6 hours. For the saline solution, the heart rate increased to 140 beats per minute from hour 1 to hour 3 and then plateaued until 6 hours. If we're looking at this in, again, an overall, how do you practically apply this? Well, one, if you're crazy enough to run for 6 hours on a treadmill, make sure you're drinking something, taking in saline solution, so something with electrolytes, or just water is going to be beneficial for you to thermoregulate. I would suggest taking in saline solution, though, if you are running for prolonged levels of time, because you don't want to be at risk for hyponatremia. This is when you're having an increased sweat production and higher amounts of sodium being excreted, and then you only have water being replenished into the body. When you have extremely low levels of sodium in the body, you can experience these symptoms of bloating, puffiness, nausea, vomiting, and headache. You may also experience cerebral edema, cognitive or central nervous system dysfunction, pulmonary edema, coma, or death coming from low levels of sodium in the body. If you look at a textbook by Tim Noakes, in that he was talking about how marathon runners, if they're out there for longer than 4 hours and drinking lots of water, so drinking at all these different stations, they are going to be possibly more at risk of hyponatremia. And what's interesting is that the mild symptoms of hyponatremia looks very similar to dehydration. And so in that, he had a couple of case studies where people were running the New York Marathon, I believe it was. They were out for a long period of time in a warm environment, drinking lots of water. They actually died because the people attending to them at the finish line gave them just water and not a saline solution with sodium in it. And so hyponatremia can be a really bad thing. It can lead to death. So you do want to make sure that you're taking in some sort of sodium or electrolytes as you're exercising in a warm environment for an extended period of time. And this can also be in food that you're consuming. So if you're having food and water, that's going to be for just fine. It doesn't have to be Powerade or Gatorade or a salt tablet where you're taking that in directly. You can just take it in as food as well. So what are the guidelines for this fluid replacement? If you're talking about beforehand, so again, at least 2 hours before exercise, taking in 400 to 600 milliliters of fluid is going to be important. During exercise, you want to try not to overdrink, but you do want to stay within 2% of your pre-exercise body weight. Now, I know this is not going to be that practical. You're not going to have a scale on the sidelines that you're going to step on mid-game or mid-performance, but trying to get into that range that you're not losing more than 2% of your body weight is going to be ideal. But if we're looking at this from a elite athlete performance side of things, most elite athletes, as Tim Noakes would point out, are dehydrated when they finish a marathon. So you are having to kind of balance that more weight that you're taking on with fluid. If you weigh less, you're going to be able to move through space maybe a little bit easier, but you also want to be able to thermoregulate appropriately. So there is kind of a balance to that fluid replacement that you need to find for yourself. You obviously don't want to have that slosh belly water feeling when drinking too much during exercise, but afterwards replacing that with fluids, salty snacks, that's going to be just great to, again, have that sodium replenishment and avoid hyponatremia. Now, you can have different forms of dieting other than the recommended percentages of 60% of carbohydrates, less than 35 fat, and less than 15 protein. People that are athletes can do a variety of different types of diets. One of those is going to be a vegetarian diet. There are different permutations for that. You can be vegan, you can be lactose, so you can have milk and cheese and things like that, or you can have a lacto-ovo diet, which is including eggs in there. The less restriction that you have, the fewer nutrient deficiencies you're also going to be more susceptible to. So if you have a well-rounded diet, you're going to be less deficient, or you're going to have less brain power that's going to be having to go at, okay, do I need to have specific vitamins and minerals in capsule form that I'm taking in because I'm going to be deficient in these because I'm not having a normal animal and plant product diet, right? So if you are having a vegetarian diet, you're going to have to supplement that with vitamin A, possibly vitamin B12, D, calcium, zinc, iron, and so on. So that is something that you'll need to be aware of. And again, it takes more planning to have an athletic diet that's also vegetarian. But again, you still would want to take in that 200 to 500 kilocalories at least 2 hours before competition, and having, again, liquid meals or something that's easily digestible. You would also want to maximize your glycogen storage and do that through carbohydrate loading or glycogen loading. And this can happen within the week before that event that you're training and preparing for. So typically you see days 6 to 4 before the event, having a normal carbohydrate concentration of that 55 to 60%. And then days 3 to 1 before that event, you're going to bump that up to an even higher percentage than 60% of your total caloric intake. Muscle glycogen stores can then double if you're doing this carbohydrate loading appropriately, and the higher that storage level is, the more energy availability you're going to have to perform that activity. There are two different types of regimens that an individual could perform if they wanted to carbo load. In one regimen, they were performing a exhaustive activity, getting down to 0, and then eating a low carbohydrate diet for 3 days. And then after that, during that third day, they switched to a high carbohydrate diet here for the 3 days prior to that activity. So they did an exhaustive type of activity after that low carbohydrate consumption on day 3, went it basically down to 0, and then had a high carbohydrate diet, again above that 60% of that total kilocalorie consumed coming from carbohydrates. And you see that they increased their overall muscle glycogen levels to above 200 millimoles per kilogram. In the other regiment, this was the normal diet that was eaten up till 3 days prior, and then they reduced the volume of training and continued to eat that normal diet, and then they changed to a high carbohydrate diet and further reduced their training volume. So they tapered, and then you can see they also increased their overall levels to more than double what they were at 6 days prior. So both of these groups had 200 millimoles per kilogram. Personally, I think that the normal diet with tapering and then transitioning to a high carbohydrate diet is probably the most easy, or the easiest one to utilize. If you do want to do that exhaustive type of activity and low carb diet and then having high carb, that's also another option for you. Carbohydrate loading is also going to greatly increase liver glycogen and reduce hypoglycemia. So it does prepare the liver for that extended period of time for exercise. Typically what you see is you're also going to increase your water weight whenever you're storing more glycogen. For every 1 gram of glycogen stored, you're going to be storing 1 or 2.6 grams of water. So you will see significant water weight gain. This may be a good thing as well when we're looking at thermal regulation and you're breaking that down to maybe increase plasma volume, maybe increase total fluid that can be utilized. But if you're doing back-to-back competition, you'd want to try and get to a point where your liver glycogen can be resynthesized quickly and consuming carbohydrate and protein intake within that 2-hour window after competition. So those individuals that are maybe track and field athletes, maybe they're working on they're doing something in the beginning of a track meet and then also at the end. So maybe they're running like a 4x8 and then a 4x4. They may want to take in, again, a easily digestible carbohydrate to try and resynthesize the energy that they have in the muscle and the liver, to then work at that higher intensity for that second bout of activity. Here you can see, related to a marathon, we have glucose levels and glucose synthesis that are inversely related, that when you have high levels of glucose, glucose synthesis is going to be lower, but at the end of the race, glucose synthesis is going to be at its highest. So that muscle glycogen resynthesis is going to be a longer period of time, and you're trying to build that back up for multiple days after that marathon. So if you notice, we're having this muscle glycogen coming back up to around 150, and this is happening over 5 days after the marathon had been performed. So again, when glycogen decreases with hard exercise, muscle glycogen synthase, that enzyme is going to be elevated, triggering an increase in the storage of muscle glycogen that is eaten. So trying to, again, return back to baseline levels for that muscle glycogen before the marathon was performed. This is, again, another video. If you'd like to click on the image and you're on PowerPoint or you're transitioning over to PowerPoint, you can see Nancy Williams talk about some of the reasons athletes might not eat enough. So we have sports drinks that are going to be marketed as enhancers for activity and exercise. you don't actually have to consume a sports drink just because it's a sports drink for sport, right? You're going to have energy that's available in electrolytes and water. You could be taking that in with normal consumption of other things, but there are widespread benefits when taking in that carbohydrate in liquid form with electrolytes and water. Typically, what you see is the more complex the carbohydrate, the greater amount that is going to be slowing gastric emptying. So you're going to keep that in the stomach for a longer period of time. So most drinks are going to have between 6 and 8 grams of carbohydrate for every 100 milliliters of fluid. And what someone should be taking in is between 30 and 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour for that competition. So again, if we just do kind of a quick math, we take this lower level here, and this is for every 100 milliliters of fluid. So you'd have to take in 1,000 milliliters or 1 liter of this to get that 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So you'd want to have, again, 1 liter per hour to hit this if you're in that 6 grams of carbohydrate for that specific drink. Again, sodium concentrations are going to help rehydration. So taking in sodium of some sort is going to, again, stave off hyponatremia and can increase thirst and palatability. So oftentimes, sports drinks will have sodium in there so that it keeps bringing you back to drink more and more. You want to have a light flavor. Some athletes don't like the strong aftertaste. And you want to also have a drink as you feel you need to that ad libitum consumption. So if you can increase that, then you can hopefully increase hydration and maintain that fluid level. Switching to assessing body composition, we can do that a number of ways. Body composition is going to be important for exercise performance, and typically what you'll see is the higher the muscle mass and the less fat, the greater success you're going to have in sport. So we can measure that and assess composition in a couple of different ways. We've got 3 different models. This model is the chemical model, looking at fat, protein, carbohydrate, water, and minerals. This is kind of what we just were talking about for most of this chapter this far. We also have an anatomical model looking at bone, organs, muscle, adipose tissue. But typically what you see in the overall assessment of body composition is a 2-compartment model where we're measuring the fat and everything else, or the fat-free mass. So we'll talk about different ways to assess each of these 2-compartment model forms. One thing is that, again, body composition is going to give you key information. So I've come across lots of students that don't want to know what their body composition is, maybe because they already know that it could be better. Well, that's fine, but if you don't know your exact values, you can't necessarily know where you've been and then assess where you're going well. And so this is going to impact your exercise training program and can also impact your exercise performance, because you may be losing too much weight and see that your exercise performance is declining. And if you had assessments of body composition previously, you can say, oh, we want to get you back to this percentage of body fat and maybe this muscle mass, this fat-free mass, so that you can improve or go back to where you were, revert back to your exercise performance that was at a higher intensity. Okay, so you can do that by assessing body composition. So just height and weight is not enough to know fitness status. And if you look at BMI, that's different than body fat percentage, because BMI is just a ratio of your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So it's really just looking at weight and height. It doesn't look at how much fat-free mass do you have and how much fat mass do you have. If we were wanting to measure body composition, though, we could use a number of different ways. You can see we've got densitometry or hydrostatic weighing. You've got DEXA, air plasmography, skin fold, and bioelectrical impedance as a few that we're going to run through in the next few slides. So you got densitometry. This is going to measure body density, meaning the fat-free mass. So the greater the density of the individual, the more they're going to sink. And there's this hydrostatic way of doing this called underwater weighing. Muscle is heavier than water, so that's going to sink. Fat is lighter than water, so it's going to float. So how well you're able to submerge and the density of that individual is going to be measured with water through Archimedes' principle. And this is going to tell you that if you're more buoyant, you're going to displace less water, so you're going to have more fat. There are some limitations to hydrostatic weighing. The lung air volume, what's remaining in the lungs, if you're blowing out all that air and submerging, great. But if you have some air trapped in there other than the residual volume, you're going to be more buoyant and it's going to look like you're fatter than you actually are. Also, there's a conversion of body density to percent fat that has some limitations, as well as fat-free density varying among people. But this is actually kind of the old gold standard. It's been used for years and years. DEXA is kind of becoming the new gold standard, but either way, underwater weighing has really good accuracy. It's between 2 and 3% of variation, but obviously you need to have water and store that in some way, and the cost to have this set up can be quite high. Here you're seeing, again, that people with the exact same BMI, they have the same weight and the same height, so their BMI is going to be the exact same, but they have differing volumes and differing densities. So if you look, Dave does not have the same fat-free mass as Jack does. Jack is jacked, right? So if you look, his fat-free weight is going to be at around 183 pounds, and his fat weight is around 21 pounds, whereas Dave is at 37 for fat and 167 for fat free. So if you wanted to get to a 10% body fat total, Jack only has to lose 0.8 pounds, whereas Dave has to lose around 20 pounds because, again, the fat free mass is going to be less for Dave than it currently is for Jack. So both of these are going to be differentiated by use of underwater weighing. Simply looking at BMI, height, weight, that's not going to cut it for the assessment of these two. We can also look at, again, DEXA. This is dual X-ray absorptiometry. This quantifies bone and soft tissue and differentiates bone from the lean mass. So you're having bone, fat, and lean differentiated. So it's really a 3-compartment model. It is precise and reliable, but extremely expensive and kind of technical. You are going to be exposed to some radiation with this, but the error is between 1 and 2%. So that variation is very, very low. You can also determine the abdominal visceral fat with this, so you can differentiate that from, say, subcutaneous and intramuscular fat. The disadvantage is, again, it's very costly. It's, over $100,000 for this machine, and you are having some radiation that you're exposed to. You have air plasmography, which is a really great tool, kind of a blend of low tech but high expense, not getting wet. So you're having it's similar to underwater weighing, but instead of displacing water, you're displacing air. This uses that same Archimedes principle. And at Concordia University, we have one of these in the lab at Thompson Hall. So if you're interested in trying to get a body composition through BodPod, this is going to be a great way to do that. Again, it has a similar air as underwater weighing. It's convenient for the subject. They're not having to get wet. But again, it is sensitive to temperature and pressure changes in the body because, like we remember, Boyle's law, temperature and volume and pressure are all going to be interrelated. So if you're not able to maintain temperature and pressure, then the volume measurement that we're trying to accomplish can be less accurate. It's also quite costly, can be around $100,000 as well to purchase one. Moving on to some more accessible and cheap assessments, body composition through skin fold is going to be easily accessible. It's widely used in the field. You're measuring the thickness at differing sites in the body of that subcutaneous fat, and then using quadratic equations to reasonably determine the percent body fat. You have to use at least 3 sites. There are 7 site measures, 5 site measures, and again, it's low cost and portable. This Lang caliper that you're seeing in this figure is probably the most expensive at around $350, but you can get plastic ones for like $5, $5 to $10. But there are some disadvantages to this. It loses accuracy in obese individuals because it's harder to get a true fold measure of that subcutaneous fat. And you need to be experienced in assessing this, because if you're not experienced, you're not necessarily going to get a good pinch, good measurement, and so on. But you do see an increase in the error from that 2 to 3 range to about 3 to 5% error off of the normal um, uh, body fat percentage. Then we have bioelectrical impedance. Again, we've talked about this in this chapter already. That fat-free mass or lean mass is going to have a greater water concentration. It's about 75% water, 73% water, whereas fat is going to have only 10% water. So if you look at electrical impulses, then if electricity travels through water faster, you could do a bioelectrical impedance, measure the distance and speed of an electrical impulse that's transmitted through the body, and see how much resistance to that impulse occurs. If there's less resistance, you have more fat-free mass. If there's high resistance, you have more fat mass. It's really quick and easy and can be very portable. Lots of people utilize in-bodies and other types of body composition through bioelectrical impedance. However, there are differences in equipment and it's impacted by water levels in the body. So if you've drank a lot of water, if you've taken a shower, if you sweated, if you're menstruating, if you're sick, if you aren't fasted, all of these things are going to add to the variability of this assessment and the accuracy. So it could be better in its accuracy. I would probably use this along with another assessment just for accuracy, but you want to make sure that you're doing this on the same time of day if you are going to be comparing measure to measure. So using the exact same time of day, and then hopefully everything else is consistent. So maybe you haven't showered, you're not sick, you haven't drank anything, you voided your bladder. All of that is going to be important for having a more accurate bioelectrical impedance or BIA assessment. So we can use this information to determine what our fat-free mass is and what our fat mass is, and then we can also use it to prescribe activity and exercise to try and change those values. Typically what we see in sport performance is the greater the fat-free mass you have, the greater your performance is. But this isn't necessarily a true thing for aerobic endurance. It may be more beneficial for you to not carry so much mass because, again, you're having to carry that body through space for a long period of time. So there is going to be a portion of fat-free mass that you may not want to continue to add as an endurance athlete. But for sport that's power, strength, and overall muscle endurance, that is going to be beneficial to have more fat-free mass. You can also look at the relative body fat, which is the percentage of body fat. Typically, again, the less that you have, the better performance, but there are exceptions, such as swimmers, they're going to be more buoyant. Sumo wrestlers will have total more weight to throw around, and then weightlifters, fat may be beneficial for them as well. So there's an optimal body size and composition for sport, depending on the sport, but it's just a guide. It's not going to be the end all be all. This can be misleading when you're using weight standards for sport. Elite athletes typically are going to define what optimal performance looks like, but do elite athletes define what optimal body composition looks like? That isn't always the case. It can be, again, individualized, which is one of those principles of exercise training. Here we can see relative body fat percentages in elite female track and field athletes. Notice that for the most part, the best performances are going to be performers that have a lower relative body fat percentage. If you're throwing things, the greater body fat percentage can be helpful. Sprinting and middle distance, again, having that lower body fat percentage is important. The best performance typically, again, is coming with lower body fat percentages in these females. However, there are some outliers, like this person. They're at 37% body fat and they're a distance runner. So they are elite and working in that higher body fat percentage. It may not be beneficial for them then to lose that body fat percentage because their body just runs best with a higher body fat percentage. So it's important to track performance over time as well as body composition over time to see, are we utilizing both of these to be the best we can be. Again, weight standards are not going to be appropriate for all individuals. They can be inappropriate for athletes. They can be obviously abused by coaches as well. And there's this misconception that if you lose a little bit of weight, that's good. If you lose a lot of weight, that's probably better. And you'll probably, if you remember going back and watching some of the Biggest Loser show, that was about a decade ago now, those that was a competition to lose as much weight as possible, but it really wasn't the most beneficial for the individual health-wise. So there is going to be possible performance declines and eating disorders that come from inappropriate uses of weight standards. Obviously, those ones that have weight classifications like MMA, wrestling, boxing, maybe even people that are doing those, figure skating or cheerleading, where they're having this body image that they have to try and keep up. Those are going to be at risk of having extreme weight loss and being also at risk of injury and poor health. Obviously, when you're trying to lose weight significantly and doing that in a short period of time, dehydration is going to be a risk that you're going to run as well. Fasting and extreme caloric restriction is going to lead to water loss. And if you're having greater than that 2%, to 4% water weight loss, that can impair performance and have a undue risk on the cardiovascular system and kidneys. Chronic fatigue can also be a risk of severe weight loss and maintaining that disordered consumption of calories. And that can lead to obviously performance declines and injury, fatigue, all due to that substrate depletion. And this mimics overtraining and chronic fatigue syndrome. So if the person isn't eating enough, they may also be overtrained. But again, that's going to be due to that substrate depletion. This can lead to the female athlete triad. So again, as I alluded to a few slides ago, if you're having that low caloric intake, you're doing higher intensity activities, you're doing higher expenditure and not replenishing that, and then also having maybe iron that's deficient, and then having menstruation and all of that, and then leading to menstruational dysfunction. That can also be paired with bone mineral density disorders. We see this in women with lean physique and low body weight or endurance sports. So skating, dancing, gymnasts, runners, swimmers, all of those are going to be more at risk for that female athlete triad. And this all kind of boils down to that dietary consumption dysfunction. So if you have disordered eating, trying to hit those weight standards, that can lead to that anemia or menstrual dysfunction, and then also that lower bone mineral density. And again, this is more prevalent in women in lean sport. So that menstrual dysfunction is going to be, or could be, delayed menarche, oligomenorrhea, or amenorrhea. So this delayed menarche would be that delayed of that first period for a female. You typically would see this with like cross-country runners, females. They're starting in middle school and trying to maintain that high performance all the way up through high school. They may actually have delayed menstrual function. They might wait until they're done with their higher intensity activity performance when they're out of high school and they actually then get a period. So if you look at, again, female high school athletes, 78% of those athletes meet the criteria for the female athlete triad. So this is not like a rare case. This is pretty prevalent. 78% meet this, and 65% of female high school non-athletes meet the criteria for the female athlete triad. So it really is important to, again, know your body, making sure that you're eating appropriately, having that energy available. And if you start to have that loss of menstrual function or you're having that delayed menstrual function, to really talk to your doctor, look at your energy that you're taking in and increase that consumption. Because most of this is, again, going to be due to caloric intake that's decreased compared to what you're expending. So, yeah, you can have severe ramifications later on in life. I've talked with a couple people that work for companies that work with eating disorder individuals, and they've seen people that have like a DEXA scan where their bones look like they're a 65-year-old female and they're 17, 18-year-old girls, which is pretty sad. They already have that, osteopenia and osteoporosis happening, and they're going to be at risk for fractures in that. So you do want to make sure that you're eating appropriately, so that, again, you can have your highest performance. And one of those signs is that, again, menstrual dysfunction. As a sidebar, I was able to coach a couple of females through this. There were some non-athletes, and I was teaching this class and talked about this, and one of them came up to me and was like, "Hey, one of my friends hasn't had her period in like months." I'm like, "Okay, well, what are they eating?" And they had kind of switched up their diet. They were just eating mainly salads and not having a high enough caloric intake. So I said, well, try eating some of these different foods, or just increasing your caloric intake overall. And over a 2-month span, that student came back to me and was so excited because their friend had gotten a normal menstrual cycle back. And it was all because they had, again, looked at their energy intake and caloric expenditure and balanced that out better. It makes sense as well, because if you are unable to even produce or consume enough calories for your own physical activity energy expenditure, why would you have the energy available to grow another human? So it makes sense that menstruation would stop if you don't have the energy to support life for both you and a baby. So again, it is important to have appropriate weight standards. If you have inappropriate standards, these are obviously going to be risky for the athlete and their health. Body composition overall may be an important thing to look at instead of just simple body weight. So like, I need to get below 125 pounds. That's just looking at total body weight. That's not looking at what's right and healthy for you. So what's your body composition? Is your body composition already at 3% body fat? Then 125 pounds is not a realistic weight for you to try and achieve. You are going to want to find the optimal range for a body composition, and then that is going to be beneficial for you to, again, be successful in your sport and also have a body composition that you feel good about. Weight standards, again, are not always appropriate. So the ideal body composition is not always best for performance. As we saw previous slide, that's 37% body fat for that female elite runner was great for them. They're an elite runner, but they didn't really adhere to the normal weight body composition standard. So it really is going to be individualized. But in the next slide, we'll show some ranges depending on sport for males and females that one would see appropriate to be in for success in their sport for their body composition. Here's that figure. You can see that for men compared to women, men are going to have a lower body fat percentage range across the board for all sports. Again, this is due to the differences between men and women, as we'll talk about in a future chapter. But you can see that there are differing percent body fats for sport and group that will change. So how do you achieve then that optimal weight and body composition? You don't want to do fasting and crash diets. Those are going to not be sustainable, right? And it causes more water and muscle loss, which is something you don't want to have when you're an athlete. You want to have muscle increase, muscle retaining, and overall fat loss. You can also be at risk of ketosis, and that is going to accelerate water loss as well, so you can lead to dehydration. The optimal amount of weight loss is going to be between 1 to 2 pounds per week, or 0.5 to 1 kilogram per week, by going through a 200 to 500 kilocalorie deficit over time. So if you have for 7 days 500 kilocalorie deficit, 500 times 7 is 3,500 kilocalorie deficit, and that's about 1 pound of fat because 1 pound of fat is 3,500 kilocalories. So if you're doing it nice and slow, having moderate caloric restriction, maybe increasing your exercise, having that caloric deficit overall between energy expenditure and energy intake to be around 500 kilocalories, that's going to be optimal for that weight loss and to increase fat-free mass. In this video, if you click on the image on the PowerPoint, you'll see some strategies for in-season diet changes that an athlete could use to lose or gain weight. The final thing that we'll talk about in this chapter is overall obesity. So if you look at obesity, there's a negative connotation that comes with it. And it makes sense because obesity impacts health in a negative way. We look at overall standards, and if you look at the BMI, these two terms, overweight and obese, are part of that. However, they're not necessarily going to be the best way to measure overall health and exercise performance. So if you look at J.J. Watt here, he would be considered obese just based off of his body height and weight. But if you look at his body composition, he's going to have a lot more fat-free mass and probably a lot lower fat mass. So you do want to make sure that you're using this appropriately. The terminology for overweight and obese can be flip-flopped a lot. So if you look at body composition, that is excessive fat on men where their body fat percentage is greater than 25%. But you also have BMI. Someone classified as obese would be 30 or higher on that ratio of kilograms over meters squared. So you want to make sure that you're using the appropriate term and looking at body composition, not simply BMI. Again, that body mass index or BMI is going to be a classification based on cut points. There are differences by race and ethnicity, as we'll talk about in the next slide. But this is a widely used standard for obesity classification, but it doesn't take into consider body composition. Again, if you're 30 and more, you're considered obese. If you're between 25 and 29.9 kilograms over meter squared, you are considered overweight on the scale. The unfortunate thing is that this is used in like health insurance determination or life insurance determination for overall risk. There is a correlation of the BMI value and cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular risk. So there is a place for this, but it's not going to be the whole picture on the individualized health of that person. Here you can see again, disease risk is going to be increasing if you're overweight, and it obviously is going to continue as you continue to increase in BMI for both men and women. Again, this is a disease risk for type 2 diabetes, for hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. And so we're looking at the values for waist circumference, as well as that ratio of weight to height. If we're looking at overall obesity, and again, typically this is measured with BMI, for the United States, the prevalence has dramatically increased since 1960. This could be due to a number of things: the transition of the types of activities that people are doing, the type of food and portion sizes that people are consuming. The prevalence of overweight hasn't changed that much, but the obesity level has significantly increased, and there's greater prevalence in some races and ethnicities compared to others. So if you look at Black women and Mexican American men, there's been a dramatic increase in obesity for those races and ethnicities compared to other races and ethnicities. But one thing that is interesting is that there's been a decreased prevalence in obesity in young children, in the 2 to 5-year-olds, which is good. And hopefully that's a sign or a harbinger of things to come, that these trends aren't going to be continuing in these kids as they move into adulthood, that they're going to have or maintain that lower prevalence of obesity. And hopefully we can turn the ship around for increased health worldwide and in the United States. In this figure, we're seeing the prevalence of obesity in the United States among adults aged 20 and older for the 2015 to 2016 years. And so you can see that there's a significant prevalence in obesity. Again, if we're looking at this, the 20-year-olds and older, we're at around 40% total between men and women. That's not good. Overall, if this is related to health outcomes, right? So cardiovascular disease, metabolic diseases, diabetes, these individuals, 40% are going to be at risk for those. And so if you look at universal health care and overall healthcare systems, this is kind of a problem for that if individuals, 40% of 20-year-olds and older are going to be obese, that's going to put a significant strain on the healthcare system. But on the flip side, there's also a lot of money to be made in the healthcare system. So at some point, it's hard to differentiate, well, is society benefiting monetarily, at least in the healthcare system, from obese individuals because there's so many resources that are being poured into that. But on the flip side, how can we maybe keep those people healthy? How can we keep those individuals that are struggling with obesity, get them to a healthy range so that they can live a high quality life and really kind of keep that financial burden off of them as well. If we break that down into race and ethnicity, you can see that the prevalence is also going to be different comparing non-Hispanic Asian, non-Hispanic Black, and non-Hispanic White percentages. You can see that non-Hispanic White, again, is going to be just trending below that 40%, but both non-Hispanic Black and the 60 years and over are going to have significant body fat percentages. And again, total, it's over 40%. And if we're looking at women, that non-Hispanic Black is over 50% that are considered obese. And that's a troubling stat. When we look at children and youth ages 2 to 19, this is a little bit more hopeful in that total, we are less than 20% of this group that is at that obesity level. So taking everyone, 2 out of 10 individuals in this age group are considered obese. The bad part is that in the 6 to 11 and 12 to 19-year-olds, there's a higher prevalence of obesity that's in some cases past 20%. But again, this is going to be looking at, for a lot of individuals, the BMI percentile, not necessarily the body fat percentage. So you would want to look at the body composition of these individuals and not simply just the BMI or the BMI percentile. With age, you can expect an increase in fat mass and a decrease in lean body mass. So over the age of 25, the average gain of weight is around 1 pound per year. So this can add up to 33 extra pounds by age 55. We'll talk about this when we're talking about the older population and how exercise can be beneficial. So this is going to have a significant effect on the healthcare system. As I had alluded to a little bit, if you have an earlier onset of obesity, and those increased rates of obesity are going to put a significant financial strain on individual families, on the healthcare insurance, on healthcare systems. You can have significant strain on that. And we really don't want individuals to be working with, morbidity. So these obesity-related diseases that are setting on earlier on, like kids with type 2 diabetes. That's just awful. So you're wanting to try and decrease that prevalence to try and mitigate those health risks and hopefully increase independence, quality of life, overall health, and longevity for the population. So increases in obesity obviously aren't going to be unique to the United States. A lot of the developed countries like Canada, Australia, and Europe have seen lesser increases, but still changes in obesity patterns. Most recent studies show that obesity is spreading to all regions of the world. And again, this is something that we're going to try and curtail because the health manifestation and health risks are going to be pretty significant to this. There are many factors, though, that go into body control and body weight management. As we talked about, hormonal management is going to be a key thing. So how much, fat is going to be stored, lipolysis, what the rate of that is. If we're looking at metabolism coming from the thyroid, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, that interaction and integration for that resting metabolic rate. All of these things are going to be related to body weight and the control of that. So if you're able to know again what that resting metabolic rate is, what your activity levels are, you can get a good idea of what your total caloric expenditure is. So then you can use that to help modify and change up your caloric intake. So an important piece to this is the resting metabolic rate. The resting metabolic rate is between 60 and 75% of your total energy expenditure. This is a key value that you should be aware of because it is such a high amount of calories that your body utilizes. This is, again, during your normal resting time frame. You are utilizing energy and breaking that down. And then you have the thermic effect of meals, or the thermic effect of feeding. This is the amount of energy it takes to process, digest, and store nutrients. And possibly this may be defective in obese individuals so that the expenditure isn't that great in the storing of that energy. And then we have that thermic effect of activity or physical activity. This is the energy expenditure that one can expect by doing physical activity and exercise. When you have the combination of all three of these, you can see how you can adapt your caloric intake to either increase or decrease and maintain that body weight, and hopefully increase fat-free mass and either lose fat-free mass or keep your overall percentages around a specific set point. This is a nice figure showing the difference between a sedentary and a physically active individual. You can see that the physically active individual is going to have a higher amount of caloric expenditure in a 24-hour period here, but their overall resting metabolic rate might not be any different. It's really just how much physical activity are we doing and how much exercise are we doing, and that adds those extra calories to the body. One thing that kind of drives me nuts is when people say, well, I only did exercise and I burned 500 calories on the treadmill, so I'm only going to eat 500 calories for the whole day. No. If you look, that individual that's doing a sedentary lifestyle is burning around 2,200 calories a day. If you're only taking in 500 calories, you're going to have a deficit of 1,700 kilocalories, and that is going to disrupt your endocrine system and your hormonal levels and can really be detrimental to you as a person for normal health and well-being, not just for exercise and performance. Obesity can derive from a number of factors. They can be physiological or lifestyle factors. Those things that you can't change are your genes or your heredity. You may be just more prone to gain weight, okay? Or it may be hormonal imbalances. So again, you have that lipase that is out of whack, or your sensitivity to adipose tissue and the levels of the adipocytes aren't really regulated well. That may be an imbalance that is happening in individuals that are obese. Or there could be that basic homeostatic mechanism that's being altered. You're maybe having a lower resting metabolic rate coming from that hormonal imbalance as well. Or it may be cultural and lifestyle factors. So, the amount of servings, the serving size, the type of food that's on there, if it's, high fat, high saturated fats. Also that with inadequate physical activity, when those two combine, that may be leading to greater obesity levels. So changing up those things that you can change can be beneficial to decreasing obesity and the risks that you'd have on your body. Clearly, energy balance is going to be key to weight loss and preventing weight gain, or at least preventing the weight gain of just fat, which is what most athletes will probably not want. So it is important to understand body composition and then do resting metabolic rate and track that energy expenditure to know what that energy balance should be, right? So increasing in caloric intake with concurrent decreases in physical activity will increase your overall energy balance and that is going to lead to overall storage of energy and can lead to weight gain. Regulation of caloric intake is less sensitive at lower levels of energy expenditure. So it is the most beneficial to do high levels of energy expenditure, do high expenditure, um, high intensity activities, because that will increase your energy expenditure. So instead of working in that um, quote unquote fat burning zone, I almost always will tell individuals work at as high of an intensity as you can for as long of an intensity as you can, because that's going to burn the most energy during the activity. And then we'll have that recycling and replenishing burning energy as well while you're at rest. So your resting metabolism can also be elevated. In the recovery side of things, if you're working at a higher intensity activity, um, while you are doing that exercise. What's interesting is that in society right now, there is a push to um, destigmatize obesity. And I understand that health and wellness is one thing, and also there's an interaction with that to psychology. And so if there are individuals that are obese and they feel like they are worth less or less than someone else because they're obese, that's not right. And they shouldn't be, and individuals that are obese should not be treated like they are less of a person. But flipping it on the other side and saying, like Cosmopolitan has says here, that being obese is healthy, that's also not beneficial for the individual, because there is an increased morbidity and mortality that comes from obesity. When you have obesity and overweight, those two factors, you're going to be more at risk of dying. So that is really, it's really a tough thing to work with individuals, because again, there is this emotional and psychological um, burden that happens and is attached to obesity that individuals have to work through. And so trying to differentiate between the worth of the individual and the health of the individual is going to be a really important thing for anyone that is training individuals that are struggling with weight and weight loss and obesity. This is going to be a really important thing for you to work with. Um, so yeah, just being cognizant of that obesity is a risk for disease and for death, but it's not going to be something that has an impact on the worth of the individual that's struggling with their weight. They're still worth just as much as anyone else is, because we're all made in the image of God. And so that worth doesn't change, right? And so if we look at the overall risk of the individual, when the BMI is greater than 35, that's a major increase in risk of morbidity and mortality. And we're having this risk associated with cardiovascular diseases and dyslipidemia, or changes in the blood lipid profile, increases in type 2 diabetes, cancer, liver and gallbladder disease, osteoarthritis, sleep apnea, and mental illness. So obviously there is going to be a whole host of health problems that are related and associated with being overweight and obese. And the metabolic syndrome or metabolic death syndrome is also paralleled with obesity. So these are, again, things that are not healthy. So it is, I think, kind of a moral and ethical wrong to say that obesity is health and healthy. Changes in normal body function can also happen when you are obese. This can, again, vary based on the individual and the degree of obesity. But again, type 2 diabetes, sleep apnea, hypertension, stroke, and cardiovascular diseases are all going to be risks for obesity. But that fat distribution is also going to have an impact on the overall risk. If you have android obesity, where you're having more of upper body fat storage, that is going to be a greater risk for cardiovascular disease, dyslipidemia, and diabetes compared to gynoid or glenoid, either way, fat distribution, where the obesity is more around the hips and thighs. That fat distribution can be assessed through a waist to hip ratio and the girth measurements of that. So while the waist to hip ratio is not a two compartment, doesn't tell you the percent body fat, it is going to be a zero compartment that does tell you what the risk overall is for cardiovascular diseases and the like. Obesity also exacerbates existing diseases. So if you are able to have weight loss happen, maybe you're able to work with a client or you yourself are able to experience weight loss in a healthy way, that 1 to 2 pounds per week, that is going to reduce the severity of chest pain or angina pectoris, hypertension, congestive heart disease, heart attack reoccurrence, varicose veins, diabetes, and orthopedic problems. So overall, this is going to be a really good thing if you're able to reduce your weight, if you're an obese individual, but you want to do that in a safe and manageable way. So again, that 1 to 2 pounds per week. I really do want to emphasize how important the emotional and psychological factors are to obesity. So there is this significant correlation of obesity and diminished emotional and psychological health. So for the health of the individual, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically, it's going to be really great to have that weight loss being experienced, but it's also going to be important to measure that in an appropriate way. So simply looking at the scale is not going to be good. Looking at body composition and doing that every 3 to 6 months is going to be a healthy way to assess that. Again, there is this social stigma that comes with obesity, which is not right. You really shouldn't have that social stigma. And again, it's also not right to flip it on the other side where you would call something healthy that isn't healthy. So trying to break a social stigma by saying something that's untrue is also not beneficial to the individual. So there is a balance to try and work through to try and help the individuals that are obese and working through that emotional, psychological factors that are detrimental, and really anyone that is working through emotional and psychological factors that are detrimental. You want to help them through that gradually, get counseling, all of that, work with, key people that will help you on that journey because everyone's got stuff that they're working through. So it really is important to do that, not just focus on one thing like obesity, but the cascade of benefit that an individual has when they are no longer obese is going to be a significant one. However, the weight loss is not simply caloric intake is less than caloric expenditure, and that's how you lose weight. It may be multifactorial, again, making sure that the types of foods you're taking in are important. The type of physical activity you're doing is important. The resting metabolic rate is important. The hormonal balance is important. So all of these things are going to be important. And so you really do need a whole team of experts, exercise physiologists, hormonal, you have all these different people that are going to help get you through this weight loss journey. To really be successful. But you do want to make sure that you're only losing that 1 to 2 pounds per week, because if you're losing excessive weight in a short period of time, you can have dramatic impact on your resting metabolic rate. And I'm just going to take some time here. I know this is a very long presentation already as it is, but if you look at a study out of The Biggest Loser, they looked at individuals over a 5-year span post ranch. So they were at the ranch, they lost a ton of weight, and then what did it look like 5 years after they left the ranch? This, I believe, came out in 2016, and they saw that individuals had a significant shock to the resting metabolic rate that never recovered over 5 years. So their resting metabolic rate lowered significantly when they lost a ton of weight in a short period of time, right? That's not good because your resting metabolic rate is a significant caloric expenditure in your overall daily caloric expenditure calculation. And so it's important for you to lose weight in a short or in a small increment over a long period of time, because this is going to help balance overall your metabolic, your endocrine, and overall caloric deficit. And it's something you can maintain and be healthy doing this. You can have obviously hormonal treatments to try and increase your resting metabolic rate and decrease your appetite. Many of these have serious side effects that can be life-threatening because, again, you're messing with your normal body chemical composition. And so if you're doing it wrong, obviously that can be life-threatening. You can also have surgical treatments where you have intestinal bypass. You can have an adjustable gastric band. You can take out parts of the small intestine so you're not having as much absorption occurring. All of these, though, are going to be reserved for the most extreme cases and ones that are going to already show that they are having weight management steps taken from exercise increases and caloric deficit coming from appropriate dieting as well. Obviously, behavioral modifications are going to be important as well. If you are allowing yourself to only eat in one location and not snacking and not doing second helpings, that can help to minimize overeating and increasing that caloric intake above what your caloric deficit is. Also, you want to pick something that is a simple approach to weight loss and that's appealing to you, because if it's appealing to you and you see results in this, and again, it's in a healthy way, that 1 to 2 pounds per week, this is something that's manageable and you can sustain. It's not like a fast crash type of diet that is unsustainable. In this video, if you click on the image on the PowerPoint, you can see again the successful weight loss approaches that some have and why some people have difficulty losing weight. So overeating and inactivity is a major cause of obesity. If you can get both of those kind of flip-flopped, eating a little bit less and exercise increases, that's going to be the best treatment. Again, you want to do this in a stepwise progression and having exercise increasing that caloric expenditure, having long-term caloric deficit, and a long-term fat loss is going to be altered again by exercise. And by doing a higher intensity activity, you'll increase that excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption, which increases your post-exercise metabolism. So you'll continue to increase your caloric expenditure even after exercise has cessed. We can see multiple examples of physical activity and its role in weight management. Here's one example of Adele. Over COVID, she had lost significant amounts of weight because she just changed up her diet and increased her physical activity. And that's great. The combination of both of those can have significant impact where your body mass composition changes by increasing your fat-free mass or maintaining it, and you're having your total weight and fat mass decreasing. The important thing to note with this, though, is you want to make sure that you're maintaining or increasing your fat-free mass, because if you're dieting so much and calorically restricting so much that you're losing fat-free mass, that's too intense. And the only way you'd really know that is by doing body composition assessments regularly. So again, changes are meant to be over a long period of time, 6 to 12 months, and you want to maintain that by, again, getting to that balance as you're getting to the ideal body composition and weight. Both aerobic and resistance training are going to be used in an appropriate weight loss program. And exercise is an important aspect in weight loss, but you have to combine that with a diet response as well. If we look at the overall weightedness, what you put in is about 70%, and what you are exercising and expending is about 30% of the caloric expenditure portion. So if you're doing it appropriately, and the main thing you want to do is just diet, great. But there are significant health benefits when you're doing physical activity and exercise that go beyond just simple weight loss. So doing exercise as well is going to be beneficial. Exercise can have some effect on appetite. It probably does not stimulate significantly your appetite. According to research, it's a little inconclusive right now. But exercise should be included in your weight management program because, again, it's going to increase your caloric deficit. Energy intake and expenditure are coupled well when you have activity levels that are high enough. So again, working at a higher intensity for as long as of a duration as you can is going to be extremely beneficial for that weight management. Exercise does positively impact your RMR, your thermic effective meals or thermic effective feeding, and can have an effect on your fat metabolism. So if we look at your resting metabolic rate, you're going to see an increase from training if you increase your fat-free mass, because resistance training increases your amount of fat-free mass that can increase your metabolic rate at rest because you have more fat-free mass that's metabolically active. Exercise can have an effect on thermic effective feeding, or how much it takes to break down, how much energy is expended during the breakdown of foods. Chronic training, though, doesn't seem to have conclusive effects on this portion of energy expenditure. So the effect of meal breakdown, it does have obviously impacts on the energy expenditure during physical activity. If you do more exercise training, you're going to increase your energy expenditure. Exercise does have effect on, again, fat mobilization. During exercise, you're seeing increases in free fatty acid mobilization. This is possibly due to, again, having higher levels of these hormones being circulated due to exercise intensity. So the higher intensity you're working at, the greater the HGH that's released, from the human growth hormone, sympathetic stimulation, and catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine that are going to be released into the body from that physical activity and exercise. There is no such thing as spot reduction. Like, you can't say, I just want to work on my love handles or just want to work on my tummy, right? You have to actually do exercise throughout the whole body, and exercise draws on all fat stores. Local exercise does not lead to fat reduction, but it does lead to muscle development. Obviously, if you do bicep curls, your biceps are going to be developing because you're doing that localized exercise for that specific muscle. But it doesn't work for, say, specific fat loss. There is this thing called the fat burning zone, and I personally dislike the fat burning zone and everything around it, because if you're looking at overall low intensity aerobics for weight loss, low intensity is going to, yes, increase your energy or expenditure from fat oxidation, but your total caloric expenditure is going to be low. So it's going to take a ton of time to utilize all the fat during that exercise that's low intensity. So the fat burning zone is going to be where fat oxidation is basically the major player for ATP production. And this is between 55 and 72% of your VO2 max. But if you want to utilize and burn the most calories possible, you'd want to work at a higher intensity activity, burning the most percentage of energy from carbohydrates, using up that storage, and then when you're at rest, you could utilize the fat that you have left for energy expenditure. So here we're seeing that the respiratory exchange ratio is, again, going to be closer to that fat, which is at 0.7. As we continue to increase in our intensity, we're going to get closer and closer to 1, which is that carbohydrates. So if you're in that low kilocalorie, low intensity fat burning zone, notice that your total kilocalories coming from fat were 110, and you also had a lower total caloric expenditure compared to the high, right? So if we look, we're burning more total calories if we work at a higher intensity than if we're at the lower fat burning zone intensity. So yes, fat is being burned at a higher percentage, but total caloric expenditure is going to be less than if we're working at a higher intensity. Obviously, there are going to be exercise gimmicks. So, just do this and you'll lose 15 pounds. That is not very effective. Again, having higher intensity activity, doing that high intensity interval training is going to be great. That is really not a gimmick. It's going to have significant bang for your buck time-wise that you're devoting to exercise. It requires a lot of work. You do have to exercise. You do have to have a controlled diet. So it's not just something easy for you to have weight loss and weight management. It is going to take planning. It is going to take a significant work. Exercise does lower the disease risk and disease mortality. That's irrespective of weight loss. So even if you're not losing any weight and you are having exercise in your diet, that's going to be beneficial to lowering your risk for mortality. And so just being active, having that active lifestyle is going to be really important no matter what your weight might be. All right, so answer to the day, is 1 to 2 pounds or 0.5 to 1 kilogram per week as the optimal recommended weight loss range. I know this was a marathon of 2 hours, but I hope you stayed with it and have a great rest of your day.